Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dhar.
Countries vary widely in terms of how well they function. Former President Trump used a term for some countries that I'll avoid, but it's hard to ignore the fact that some states are simply broken, while others seem functional and prosperous. What explains these differences? In this episode, I discussed this question with James Robinson, who's written a book called The Narrow Corridor, co-authored with Daron Acemoglu. This book is a sequel to their bestseller Why Nations Fail, which argued for the importance of institutions and broad-based participation as being key ingredients of prosperous and stable societies. In The Narrow Corridor, they build on their previous work and demonstrate the importance of the balance of power between the state and society and how this is achieved as being essential in creating prosperity and progress. James is an economist and political scientist at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. James, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
So, before we get into the subject of the day, I just thought we'd warm things up a little bit, share something with the audience just about yourself, anything personal, like, your rock star musical capabilities or any such thing, or the path that has brought you to this point.
A zero on the rock star musician. Unfortunately, that road closed down a long time ago. Although I do have a photograph of me playing the guitar in the LSE band competition, I think in 1982. I can let you have that if you like.
So you could have gone pro then.
I doubt it. No. I sensibly rethought my life. I don't know what to say about myself. I think that I was very lucky. In life. I think I was very lucky in life in that my parents were both very working class people from the north of England. And as such, they had terribly powerful work ethics and they were obsessed with education. Education was the way out of poverty. And they were the first, both of them were the first in their families to kind of get any sort of higher education. And so, I received from them this obsession with learning and books and education and I sort of turned my life into that, and I think that's been, I think that's been very rewarding. I sometimes wonder how it all kind of managed to work out, but that you don't worry about things like that in life. You just have to plunge in and get on with it, and they also taught me that. So I think I've been very lucky from that perspective. We never had any money, but somehow we were living in this environment in England where schooling was open to you. Things were open to you. Yeah, there was favoritism and there was a class structure, but there weren't that many barriers. As I've worked in other parts of the world over the last 30 years, I've realized that, for all the problems that there were in Britain when I was growing up, the sort of barriers that you see everywhere, in the developing world were not really there in Britain. For all my complaints about the aristocracy and high society and all of that, and so I think from that perspective, by world historical standards, I always count myself very fortunate to grow up where I grew up with,
born at the right time too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Born at the right time.
Would have been different 300 years before that.
Absolutely. Or even now, possibly. Yes, even now, possibly. I see, people who are kind of my age struggling, to do, what I did. And I absolutely, yes.
I, obviously want to talk to you about the latest book you've written called The Narrow Corridor. But before that, I just want you to set the stage and talk about your book from several years ago, like 7-8 years ago now. Great title, Why Nations Fail. I mean, I love the title. But, sketch out in a few sentences what you said in that book, and then, what you perhaps had overlooked or developments that happened in the, subsequent to that motivated you to write The Narrow Corridor.
Yeah, I mean, Why Nations Fail was an attempt to communicate many of the academic ideas we'd been developing over the previous 15 years. but to a broader audience. We felt that many things could be said in a simpler way than perhaps they were said in kind of scientific publications. And also one of the motivations was Daron, Acemoglu and I, we're very curious about social science outside of our expertise. I spend most of my time reading books by historians and anthropologists and sociologists, and we're very interested in details and stories and case studies and things that economists are typically not interested in. But we've always found that very rich, and it's motivated many of the pieces of research that we've done. But then when you end up publishing the paper, the editors and the referee say, oh, delete that section. So we had all of this empirical material, which has sort of inspired us. And we thought, well, if it inspired us, maybe it would inspire somebody else or some student or somebody just to learn or think about these things. So that was actually part of the motivation. Most of the empirical material we already had when we wrote that book. That's why the new book was much harder, because we actually had to do the research. The first book was more like we just had to kind of coordinate everything or orchestrate it. And what was it about? It was about what we thought we'd learnt about what generates economic prosperity and economic success and economic failure. Why call it Why Nations Fail? Well, I think, for us, it's the failure has always been more mysterious, because every economist agrees on what makes a country prosperous. What we don't understand is, why is it that any society doesn't do the obvious things that are necessary to become prosperous? Invest in schools, invest in education, create systems of property rights that create incentives, create competition, stimulate entrepreneurship, innovation. There's many models of this. So it's all it's not rocket science. So the puzzling thing in economics is why nations fail. Like, why on earth doesn't Haiti do that? Why on earth doesn't Colombia do that? And so that's why the book is called that. And the explanation is, well, it's because of the politics. That, yes, the economics may all be straightforward, but to create an economy, to create a set of institutions, to create sets of property rights or create schools or whatever, that takes politics. Politics has to be aligned. So the book is about a very simple dichotomy we call, institutions that create broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities, of the sort my mother and father had, for example. We call those inclusive economic institutions, and economic institutions that don't create incentives and opportunities, we call those extractive economic institutions. They create barriers to entry, they create monopolies, they create insecure property rights, they lead to massive underinvestment in public goods or insufficient innovation. And so the economics, and I think that part, the economics, is all kind of well understood. In some sense, we might have our own jargon for it, but it's something that every economist would understand. Adam Smith would probably have understood it in the 18th century. But the main contribution is to think about the politics behind that. What's the politics behind the creation of inclusive institutions? And what's the politics behind the creation of extractive institutions? And that's the most original and interesting part of the book. But of course, that dichotomy, inclusive and extractive economic institutions, inclusive and extractive political institutions, you have to project a lot of complexity and nuance, to be able to talk about something so simple. That was the one thing we had a lot of difficulty with, of course, being academics, actually trying to say something simple. But I've realized I don't know how many hundreds of talks I've given about that book. I gave one yesterday, actually. People still want me to talk about it. And that simplicity is powerful. It's we could have made it more complicated, but I'm glad we didn't, because, you need to keep it simple to get the ideas across. But in some sense, the new book is sort of reflecting on, it's almost subconscious. I don't think we set out to reflect on the weaknesses of Why Nations Fail, but things like that happen without you really being conscious of them, I suppose. Like you're kind of worried about things, or you're anxious. And I would say there were two things we're anxious about. One is, as I said, in many ways, Why Nations Fail was a sort of compilation of empirical examples that we'd understood from our reading. And I obviously you tend to get very invested in some parts of the world, or some, I'm very interested in countries and places and people and cultures. And But I know a lot about, I worked a lot in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. I worked a lot in different parts of Latin America. But there's other parts of the world, Asia, China, India, so when you give there's very little discussion of that in Why Nations Fail. So every time I gave a talk about Why Nations Fail, I ended up talking about India and China, of course, and the people want to know, why isn't that in the book? And that's just because it escapes your knowledge. So we've been reading nonstop about India and China, I suppose, since we wrote the book, and trying to sort of think, but in a way, trying to, it's not like, okay, how do we cram that into our framework? I mean, India and China comes up in Why Nations Fail, but it's sort of, how do we cram that into our framework? And I could still, tell that narrative, but I suppose we're also learning to learn from India and China as well, because a theory that you developed thinking about Western Europe or maybe Latin America perhaps doesn't do a good job of explaining China. I think that's also a problem.
Indeed. In fact, I recall our conversation in India, in Goa, actually, where we were talking about India and China and how China fit into your framework of Why Nations Fail. I'm myself actually very interested in different parts of the world. I actually lived in Ethiopia for a few years as a kid. My father was posted in Congo in 1960. And so I read that part of your book with great interest because I actually grew up with 8mm films that he'd taken in Congo, in Katanga and Kinshasa and places like that. And, my dad had actually firsthand stories of how one of the tribes had captured Brian Urquhart, who was the American envoy, and they were going to eat his heart. And, he rescued him from, almost near certain death. And then weirdly enough, it turns out that Brian Urquhart's grandson is a really good friend of my son. And this just emerged completely out of the blue. We were at home one day and my son said to me, "Hey, Dad, wasn't your dad in Congo?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Theo's grandfather was there." And I said, "What was his name?" And he says, "Brian Urquhart." And I said, "Wow, that name is so familiar to me." And you can tell Theo he wouldn't be around today if my dad hadn't been successful in releasing his grandfather. But, one of the things I really enjoy about reading your book is that you're a great storyteller, and it really shows your attention to detail and trying to explain something that cannot be explained by simple economic theory, but by actually looking at history and political processes and historical institutions and stuff like that. So I really enjoyed it. And the other thing, by the way, I enjoyed about Why Nations Fail is that you take the various hypotheses one by one and sort of dismantle them. Was it religion? Was it climate? Was it the southern versus northern hemisphere? All of these quasi-popular theories. I like the way you address them and develop the theory. So that's my recollection of Why Nations Fail. Let's talk about the narrow corridor, which seems to have a somewhat different feel to it. It seems more like a process kind of a view of development. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think you said it exactly right, that one of the things that we thought was problematic about Why Nations Fail, I think, was too much about, this is a sort of discontinuous jump. You have extractive institutions and then you just kind of you just put the inclusive institutions switch on and then you're fine. But actually, it's much, as you say, it's much more of a, building an inclusive society. I think it's much more of a process. And again, I think, the main emphasis here is on politics and trying to build inclusive political institutions. And, just to give you an example of how the problematic way that Why Nations Fail simplified things, is we have this, where do extractive institutions come from? Well, we say, extractive economic institutions come from having extractive political institutions. And what does extractive political institutions mean? Well, it means that, either power is narrowly concentrated in some people's hands, or the state lacks capacity or power to kind of control or regulate society. So if either of those things are true, then you have extractive political institutions. But then, that's like sort of putting China and Somalia in the same category. So Somalia doesn't have a state. It's actually, if you looked at traditional Somali society, you could say that's actually it's a very participatory democratic place. Decisions were made collectively amongst adult men, but there was no state whatsoever. So that's extractive political institutions. But China has this very narrowly concentrated power, but it does have it has a 2,000-year history of more than that, of state bureaucratization, centralization. So that distinction, that distinction looks very important, and it's particularly important once you start asking about the process, as you point out. Like, how is it that these societies evolve, and what would have to happen in Somalia, to get more inclusive political institutions, and what would have to happen in China? And of course, those two things are completely different. So we wanted to have a framework which allowed us to talk better about the process, and also which could account more for these very different types of societies that we said had extractive political institutions.
I was particularly struck by your chapter on India this time, and you talked about, I guess it's called the broken queen. And in Nations Fail, you had this emphasis on elites. And this book, I noticed that you actually refer to Bihar, one of the states in India, where actually the lower castes took over and became the new elite. And so it was dysfunctional in a different way. But just to sort of back up a little bit, you talk about the caste system in India as being a major impediment to developing state capacity, because you essentially have the society with sort of just ingrained practices that are then more like affirmed by the state. And this lack of mobility and all kinds of negative aspects of that system that inhibit state capacity and development. So just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about India is that when you get into the history, there's this very deep history of participation and accountability and representation, and which goes back all the way, to the time of the Buddha. That's very powerful, that history. But it's sort of riven with all these caste distinctions, so the main sort of dynamic in the book is inclusive political institutions emerge through this sort of competition between state and society, or you could say state elites and society. And in this competition, both sort of get stronger. The state gets stronger, it kind of competes with society, so it develops capacity, it's trying to control society, and society gains capacity, and it increases its ability to kind of organize collectively or define sort of collective objectives or goals, and it becomes more institutionalized. And it's that's kind of broken. We call this competition, you said exactly that the chapter's called The Broken Red Queen. We call this competition the Red Queen effect, and it's that's broken in India because of the caste system. Society can't act in a kind of collective way because it's divided against itself. That chapter is very inspired by the writings of Ambedkar, the famous Indian kind of intellectual who was a Dalit, who wrote most of the Indian constitution. And he writes about how the caste system divides, Indian society into these different sort of compartments that you're kind of locked into by what he calls the dogma of predestination. And so our idea, how do you think about India? India is not like China whatsoever. China never had any kind of history of participation or representation like that. But in our view, the Red Queen effect just can't get going in India. It can't get going. The state is weak, but society is sort of. I think the Bihar thing is interesting. Maybe you could tell me. Oh, but things are very. I'm not an expert in India at all, so this just reflects our reading of Indian history and sort of trying to understand how it speaks to our framework and how to sort of reconcile the history with our framework. So we call this, it's not a term, it's a terminology we introduce when we talk about Latin America, but it's more like what we call a kind of paper leviathan, in the sense that it's sort of, the state is weak and society is weak, but it's sort of stuck there. It's stuck and it can't get going. This dynamic can't get going. And the reason it's stuck there is because of this caste system. That's what we would say.
So, James, I think I got a little bit ahead of myself, and I want to come back to India, but I think I should give you a few minutes to just sort of define what you mean by this narrow corridor, because, you have two axes, which is the capacity of the state and the capacity of society on the Y and X axes, respectively. And you refer to a narrow corridor. It looks like some sort of a cone that starts at the origin and then sort of widens out. So why don't you talk about that, and also the notion of the Leviathan that you take from Hobbes, and you've got several types of Leviathan. So just take a few minutes and build the theory, and then we'll come back and discuss different parts of the world in terms of this language.
Right. So, think of when we were talking about why nations fail, I said inclusive political institutions, that's having a state with capacity, but it's also having power broadly distributed in society. So those are like the two axes we have in the new book. We have the kind of the power of the state and the power of society. And so what we sort of say is that there's a sort of trichotomy here. There's a situation where the state dominates society, and there's a situation where society dominates the state, like Somalia, for example. And in between, there's this cone you're talking about. That's where state and society are balanced in some sense. And the idea is that, what is it that creates inclusive political institutions? Well, you have to get into this balance between state and society. And when you get that balance, that's what sets off this Red Queen effect, this dynamic competition between state and society. And that creates stronger states and stronger societies. But if you topple off on one side or the other, there's two other kind of attracting states. One is the state gradually gets more and more and more powerful against society and ends up dominating it. But the opposite thing can happen too. So I think, what's sort of attractive mathematically, there's a whole kind of mathematical micro foundations for that picture, is that, with one sort of set of mechanisms, one can get these very different outcomes. You could say China is, in China they eat rice, and in Somalia they have camels, and maybe that determines everything. But our view is, these big structural geographical things are not really that important in understanding human society. It's much more about how the humans themselves do things and how they organize things and how they compete and how they innovate. And so part of that diagram is supposed to sort of, and when you get into the historical stories, in the book, that's what we sort of emphasize, that if you went back in history, you'd see, well, China wasn't so different, going back. There was representation and accountability, and society tried to get elites under control and stuff. But then it topples out of the corridor. You think of the first dynasty as a sort of model. A model emerges of how to dominate and micromanage society, and it sort of becomes hegemonic, and then it reinforces itself, and then you go off to this equilibrium that we call the despotic Leviathan. Hobbes's idea was there's just a state, the Leviathan, and you need the state because there's all this disorder, and people want to create a Leviathan. But the thing is, in reality, there's different sorts of Leviathan. Hobbes thought the governance of the state really wasn't very important. He does discuss it, but he, his view was that states, it's just in the DNA of the state to kind of produce order, and he didn't really see there being a big divergence between the interests of the sovereign, or whoever's running the state, and society. But our view is that there's probably going to be a very big divergence. And so that's this sort of path where the state dominates society. We call that a despotic Leviathan. On the other side, you could topple off in the other direction, whereby the state sort of collapses and society dominates the state, or there's maybe even no state, like in traditional Somalia or some of the African examples we talk about. And that's, we call an absent Leviathan. So that's another that's this other kind of mirror image of the Chinese case. In the middle, it's where, in this corridor where you get this dynamic and you end up with what we call the shackled Leviathan. I don't know how useful this terminology is. I never really liked it very much, whether it's good to put names on these things. So that's a shackled Leviathan. So it's a Leviathan. One of the interesting results in the theory is actually, it's actually more powerful than despotic Leviathan, because it's actually in this competition, in this race against society, that you develop capacity. So society pushes the state. So a shackled Leviathan kind of ends up more powerful than a despotic Leviathan, But it's also under the control of society. And, that's part of the reason why it's more powerful, because people trust it and they're willing to kind of concede authority to it and cooperate with it. And so that's, so we try to emphasize this kind of trichotomy between different state and society relationships, and then this sort of historical dynamics of how one gets into the basin of attraction of these different types of Leviathan.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the term shackled Leviathan in a positive way. I usually think of shackles as slavery or something like that, but in your usage, that's actually a positive thing because it's being constrained by societies. It doesn't have sort of unbridled power like the despotic Leviathan. So did Britain and Western Europe and North America just get lucky? I mean, historically lucky in being in this cone where there was this constant tussle and reevaluation. I mean, you talk about the fact that the framers of the United States Constitution overlooked lots of things, and that a lot of the amendments to the Constitution came much later, with gradual power being given to the center and the states sort of acquiescing gradually about things because they felt comfortable that this power would not be abused. And also, the thing I want to add there is, did religion, namely Christianity, had Christianity sort of come to terms with science and the fact that it would have to share power with the emerging state? It seems to me that a lot of things had to sort of come together for this to actually work. If the church had been really, I guess for lack of a better term, really rabid in trying to hold on to Christian beliefs, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. Maybe it just sort of loosened up at the right time as well.
I think that is our view, that, when we tell the story about, why did Western Europe look the way it does, or why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Britain or whatever, it's really the sort of coincidental merger of, late Roman state institutions with this very participatory politics of the Germanic tribes, like the Franks, that or the Saxons, or, and the origin of Western Europe is really, why are there all these parliaments everywhere in Western Europe? And why were the parliaments in the north of Spain but not the south of Spain? Because the north of Spain was conquered by Germanic tribes, and they created this very participatory type of institution. So that, for us, that's sort of getting into the corridor, and it's sort of having state institutions, including church institutions. Clovis, who founded the Merovingian dynasty, he converted en masse with his army, to Catholicism, because the church was a very important part of the Roman state by that time. And so they got language, Latin, legal ideas, fiscal, administrative organization, but they fused it with this very participatory type of politics. So it's sort of that's getting you into the corridor. And then, but obviously this doesn't look like modern inclusive institutions at all. And that's where the process aspect is very important, because we want to say that kind of sets you off on this path. But there's a lot of work to do, before you get to something like modern state institutions or modern democracy. But that dynamic, that's something was very missing from Why Nations Fail. And but I think that is luck. I mean, I don't think there's any, I think social scientists love to come up with these arguments, which I've always found absurd, about why certain parts of the world were sort of favored ecologically or geographically, or that's just never seemed plausible to me, personally. I think it's just, I don't know what it is about it. Maybe it's something to do with the structure of social science that makes it hard to, economists, for example, I don't know in your space, of academia, but economists are obsessed with these sort of methodological ideas, especially things that are endogenous and things that are exogenous, And so exogenous means stuff I don't have to explain, and I just kind of hold it constant, like the weather and the climate and latitude. But and there's something about the kind of implicit way economists think that ends up always going back to that as being like the ultimate cause. And I just never believed that whatsoever. It seems to me, if you know something about human history or the world today, humans can organize society in completely different ways. In fact, for me, the history of humanity is not succumbing to kind of ecological or environmental constraints. It's actually overcoming them. Right? Like when human beings, spread out through the world, there's 9,000 species of ants, for example. Did you probably knew that. Anyway, there's a lot of species of ants. And when ants got to Canada, I'm not quite sure where ants started from, but anyway, when they got to Canada, they speciated. Because Canada's a pretty cold, hostile place. When humans got to Canada, they developed a taste for seal blubber and they invented igloos, and ice fishing. So they adapted. That's my view of sort of humanity. So I do think there's this sort of indeterminacy where chance and models and culture, something comes in, like who was Lord Shang or the legalist philosophers in China? They came up with a model of how to organize society, which they managed to fuse with kind of Confucian principles that many people bought into. But if you look at that, do you think about intellectually the Confucius's ideas about, what a legitimate organization of society was, or how should authority work, or how should the state be governed? That's completely different from Western ideas. Look at Aristotle. If you read Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle was completely, already by that time, the Athenians were completely skeptical, that someone in authority was going to abuse their position and become a tyrant. The Athenians were very worried about tyrants. Confucius thought, no, the leaders will cultivate the way and virtue, and this will lead to good governance. That's a heck of a different way of thinking about state and the governance of the state, and I suppose being an economist, most economists are kind of crypto-Marxists, like modern economics inherited this sort of extreme materialism, from Marxism. And, everything is the forces of production and so I think Acemoglu and I have had a really hard time over the years grappling with these questions about culture and systems of ideas that humans create to give meaning to their lives and their societies. And we're working much more on that at the moment, but I'm worried that we're too old, and set in our ways to make much progress.
As you were talking, I was reminded, I think you have a quote by someone who says that economics has chosen to address this problems of solved political economies, or something to that effect.
Abelerner was a very distinguished economist. Said that economics made its life simple by studying solved political problems. But it turns out that if you want to understand why Haiti is poor, you can't ignore the unsolved political problems.
Indeed. I was thinking also that, you referred to the bubonic plague as being a major driver of, a lot of the serfs got wiped out and suddenly there was a shortage of labor and they got, more bargaining power and the elites had to give a little and that led to some major reforms. So it's all these sort of exogenous events, shocks, key events that history has hinged on, that development has hinged on in progress.
Even that which you're describing, which is exactly right. In some sense, that the consequence in England was very idiosyncratic. Like, why did it have that effect in England? It was because at the time of the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror invaded, and he expropriated the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, and he handed out the land to his about 800 Norman, what became his tenants-in-chief, 800 Norman knights and whatever, But he was terrified that he couldn't give huge bits of land to these people because some of them wanted to take over from him. His whole claim to the throne was sort of dodgy. He was called William the Bastard, for example. So his legitimacy was so he was really worried about making somebody too powerful. So what did he do? He scattered all the land. So some lord didn't get one big piece of land. He scattered it all out, so that when the Black Death happens, what's interesting about that is that all these lords had like little bits of land, manors next to each other. So they were all competing for this labor. But if you compare Eastern Europe, for example, when the Black Death hits in Eastern Europe, east of the Elbe, for example, you had these massive estates. And then you had the opposite outcome, actually. Instead of serfs becoming freer, because of all this competition, labor was scarce. So what do you do when labor is scarce? Well, you try to really ratchet up the control of it. So that's actually a great example of how, here's a big consequence, here's a big sort of shock to the society, but it has very different implications depending on how society was initially organized.
It gives me a new appreciation for the role of history and randomness in why different parts of the world look like they do. So let's come back to India. You describe how society is hampered by long ingrained divisions such as caste and hierarchy, which are implicitly acknowledged by the state, which in turn feels powerless to correct them. Is there any hope of developing true state capacity as long as these artificial divisions exist?
Well, that's a complicated question. I mean, you could say in medieval England, you had all sorts of similar types of issues. You had hereditary occupations. If you go back to the 14th century poll tax records, you can see that, Mr. Miller, his occupation was a miller, and Mr. Smith, his occupation was a blacksmith. So that was never kind of embedded in religion, I suppose, in the same way that it didn't have the sort of supernatural kind of element that it has in India, or the religious element. Those distinctions withered away in the late medieval period with social change and economic change. So I guess there are examples of similar types of distinctions that were eroded over time. The world changes and people's identities change as well. So it could be that there could be changes in identity which make caste much less salient, and I always think, to give you an analogy, which makes me sort of doubt this caste discussion. Most social scientists talk about Africa like divided into ethnic groups, like this morning I was talking to my friends in Sierra Leone. I have this project, and, there's the Temne in the north and there's the Mende in the south, and they're all divided into these ethnic groups and they can't cooperate and they're polarized. But actually, my experience working in Africa is that's sort of ludicrous. The Africans have many different sorts of identities. They have cross-cutting identities. They all speak lots of different languages. Every African I know speaks like 5 languages. They're really used to dealing with difference and different cultures. So I've always found this narrative of ethnicity wildly overdone in Africa, actually. There's many sort of cross-cutting. Here's an example. In 3/4 of African languages, the word for guest, stranger is the same. It's exactly the same word, So stranger, like if you read social science, they say, oh, like he's a Mende, he's a Temne, the Temne are strangers. Actually in Mende, the word for guest and stranger is the same word, So what does that say? Africans don't think about this the way that we think about it, So there's an example to sort of say, and I'm sure this is true of India. I just don't know enough about. I've never done research in India. This is just my own experience in Africa. I started writing about that recently. I think it's a sort of misperception of Africa. It's sort of like we come as outsiders and we want to find a way of sort of simplifying all the complexity, and sort of somehow people latched onto this ethnic narrative as a way of kind of like putting Africa into a box and saying why Africa is sort of less successful than we are. Because they're all divided into these ethnic groups. And of course, castes matter in India, and people do have these caste identities, but they have these other identities too, and like being Indian or like being Bengali, or and maybe those can become stronger, and caste will wither into the background, or it'll take its place in religion, but it won't affect people's politics or economics in the same way that perhaps it has done in the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. But I think what you're implicitly saying is that hopefully those distinctions become less important and other identities take over, like being Indian or being, Bengali or Tamilian or whatever. That's perfectly fine, as long as it doesn't inhibit mobility, which seems to be a big drag on capacity, right? If you're born into a lot and you just can't move, it seems to me that India really does need to get rid of those kinds of constraints to actually promote, greater mobility. And I guess I see it happening. I mean, just in sort of my own lifetime, I see some changes where the Indian middle class now is a lot larger than it used to be, when I was a kid. So I do see progress, but it's still sort of shackled by these ingrained practices. And I guess what I hear you saying is that hopefully other identities will dominate those that are less restrictive in people's sort of social, and economic mobility.
That's happened. When I was a kid, if you watch the BBC, everybody in the BBC had an Oxbridge accent. They talked like they were the Queen. You could, a Scottish person, somebody from Northumberland or Scotland or Liverpool or Birmingham could never get a job, on the BBC. But now it's like an affirmative action machine for regional identities. Like those things stop mattering. I think that sort of thing stopped mattering in Britain, actually. It's like people don't care if you're Scottish anymore, Liverpool, or, like my mother used to say when she moved to London, she had to learn how to speak properly, But now you don't need to worry about that. And I think that's a good thing, So maybe that's a little example, but it is sort of identity change, and it's more accepting of other people's identity, and I'm not discriminating against you because you talk like someone from Yorkshire, I don't think you're stupid or whatever.
So does Islam have the same kinds of problems as well, in a different form that we're discussing that exists in the caste system, in terms of, let's say, attitudes towards women? And Islam can be equally sectarian, I've realized. In fact, I've often had this discussion with people that maybe this notion of caste or sectarianism is sort of a subcontinental phenomenon, not just a religious one. But does Islam have the same problem? Does it have the same kinds of constraints in terms of enabling state capacity because of its practices?
I think Islam is very interesting, in the sense that it's very, at some level, it's very egalitarian sort of, it's a kind of very universal. There's a sort of universal society of believers, which is kind of encompasses caste or nation or, and it's very egalitarian. We're all the same, in front of God, and the same rules apply to everybody. And
except if you're a Shia.
Well, yeah,
I'm being semi-facetious, but
yeah, there's conflict over what the correct interpretation of Islam is. Obviously, there's different factions, as there is within any religion, I suppose, within Christianity, and there's different interpretations of, who was the true successor to to Muhammad. And I'm not sure I have a deep understanding of that, but what I do think about Islam is that, I find it very interesting from a sort of political point of view, because it's a very different conception of the state from the Western conception. The conception of the state, going back maybe to Aristotle again, would be, the state is meant to serve the general welfare, and it's meant to create conditions conducive to the welfare of the people. So Aristotle spent a lot of time talking about different way, who should run the state, how should it be organized. But that in the Islamic political tradition, that's absolutely not what the state is about. The state is about implementing the Sharia. God revealed the law. And the law can be interpreted, but the state doesn't legislate. The state is meant to implement the Sharia. So I find that very interesting, just kind of as a social scientist. It's a completely different conception of the state to either the Chinese political history or Western political theory. It's a very different idea. I always think like the Taliban. If you read about the history of the Taliban, that's exactly what the Taliban had in mind. The role of the state was to implement the Sharia, God's law. And so that's massively affected how you govern the state, because how do you govern such a state? Well, you need to have the people who are most learned in the Sharia. So why did they pick Mullah Omar? Because he was respected as being, one of the best scholars of the Hadith and the Quran and the Islamic legal traditions. And so they worry about him misbehaving or, like turning into a tyrant? No, they didn't worry about that, because that's just somehow not a preoccupation of that way of thinking about the state. So I've actually been reading quite a bit about this, because I'm not sure how it fits into my paradigm, I should say.
I mean, it seems to me that it fits into your paradigm in that it implies that it would inhibit people's freedom, which is essential to putting checks on the state. So it's almost by definition, it would limit how much society can do in terms of keeping the state under control. If the whole function of the state is to implement Sharia law, it seems like there isn't that much room for discussion or debate, is there?
No, and I think the dominant tradition in Islamic political theory has been God will deal with these problems, like God will deal with problems of misgovernance. And, which was what, that's what St. Augustine thought, or many religious scholars in early medieval Europe thought that God would deal with problems of governance in the state and people should just put up with it, and I think that's been the dominant tradition. So you're exactly right from that perspective that, that it doesn't involve a lot. It's not a situation which kind of is encouraging for this, this Red Queen type dynamics of state and society, because there's much more rigidity about what the state should do and what it can do. So there's much less room for it to sort of grow. But it's also, it is a situation with the rule of law, in an interesting way. There are laws and, even the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan. So, give you one very specific example. What was the main tax? Where did the Ottoman state get most of its tax revenue from? From the poll tax, from this poll tax on non-Muslims, which was one of the few taxes that Muhammad specified as being legitimate. So there were all these restrictions on the type of taxes you could raise, and actually, that the Ottomans, they tried to cheat a bit on the margins, but actually they were massively constrained by the Islamic doctrines about what sort of taxes were legitimate. Noah Feldman has an interesting book about this. Why is there this upsurgence of Islam, in the Middle East and the many parts of the world? It's a reaction to all this sort of despotism, to the Assads and the Mubaraks and the Gaddafis and all of this horrible kind of dictatorships and despotism. It's the law. It represents the law. The Islamic State represents the rule of law to people, and I think that's an interesting thing that perhaps people in the West don't appreciate very much, that aspect of things. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I agree with you. It doesn't look like from our perspective. I'm not sure I completely understand how it fits into our paradigm. That's what I meant to say. But I agree with you. It doesn't look like a situation which is propitious for this type of dynamics to get moving. Yes.
Right. That sort of was my takeaway from that it was different form of the caste system, at the risk of simplification. But it just sort of made me think of that. So I want to pursue a new angle. Actually, two things. One is I just wanted to talk about America and the American Leviathan. You point out that it's a shackled Leviathan. It has very limited kind of powers, and that's sort of by design. What are the downsides of that in America?
Yeah, I think there are lots of downsides. I think there's no such thing as a perfect society. I think all these problems are only solved imperfectly, even by the most kind of successful societies. I think if you went back, in the history of the United States, which has cast a long shadow, I think, over the present, you think about slavery, for example. We talk about how, there's a famous argument by the historian Edmund Morgan that in some sense it was the oppression of the slaves that facilitated the creation of this more democratic society for white people, because white elites like Jefferson were not worried, about poor whites promoting redistribution of income or destabilizing property rights, because they all held slaves. He might have had more slaves than poor whites in Virginia, but every white in Virginia had slaves. And so that gave them all a vested interest in sort of secure property rights. So that gave Jefferson and other kind of elites the confidence to sort of say, yeah, okay, let's have universal white suffrage and let's give white people, white men the vote. So there's a sort of very perverse kind of synergy between sort of more inclusive institutions for whites resting on the exploitation of slaves and black people. So I think that, by world historical standards, you could say, even having universal white male suffrage in 1820 or something was pretty inclusive, and power was pretty broadly spread amongst white men and, maybe white women, but behind the scenes, not formally enfranchised. So by world historical standards, we'd say that was a society which was, pretty inclusive, where power was pretty broadly distributed in society, where there was a lot of, social capital, as de Tocqueville talked about, ability to organize collectively and complain and, force the state to be accountable and keep it under control. But there were also, terrible parts of the society too, which have blighted the history of this country and left a huge shadow, which the United States in many ways still hasn't come to terms with these kind of original sins. Look at the sort of incredible patterns of discrimination against African Americans, look at incarceration rates in this country, the criminalization of Black people and discrimination. So that's a very imperfect thing. I mean, in many ways, of course, the United States has been an incredible success story. It's kind of sucked talent, and it's been incredible from all over the world. It's been incredibly innovative technologically, economically, very dynamic. Many aspects of the design that achieved that have been very imperfect. So, for example, all of us who were hoping Donald Trump was going to lose the election, we were very happy with federalism. People talk about checks and balances in the United States, but you see how important federalism is. Donald Trump could deinstitutionalize the federal state, but he couldn't deinstitutionalize the state in Illinois, for example. Why? That was federalism. But federalism, of course, also allowed the southern states to carry on exploiting Black people hideously until the 1960s, until the Voting Rights Act and until the Civil Rights Act and until the Civil Rights Movement. So there's many aspects of the US are sort of double-edged swords, if I can use that expression, which have good sides and have helped build this sort of very dynamic, successful thing that the United States has been for 200 years. But there's a huge underside to many of those aspects as well.
So let's introduce a new and powerful actor into this dynamic between state and society, namely big tech. You've talked about the fact that a lot of infrastructure development in the United States in the 1800s, including the post office and the railroad, was based on creative public-private partnerships because the state just lacked the capacity to take on ambitious projects. This led to enhanced state capacity as well as opportunities for the society to develop businesses, including along the newly developed railroad. It seems to me that the modern analog to that is that big tech has developed the digital railroad and what flows along it, thanks to sort of the implicit protections provided by the state in the form of Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So because of that, they've now amassed great power, and in the process, become even more powerful than the state in many respects. Is it time for the US Leviathan and society to collectively exert some muscle now? Does the current state of affairs with big tech bother you at all? And how should lawmakers think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly concerned about it. I think my general view is that, technology doesn't have any one specific implication for state-society relations. It just depends on how it's used and who controls it. I mean, I always when I teach, I teach these PhD students, I teach these two papers back to back about the spread of radio, and in the 1930s. And in the United States, what you see as radio spreads, they ask questions in the census about whether you had a radio. When radio spreads, then a county which has more radios, the politicians have to pay more attention to it because people are better informed. And so what you see is that policy becomes more sensitive to counties where there's more radios. But of course, at the same time, Hitler was buying every German a radio so they could listen to his speeches at home. So there, it's a bit like the Black Death example we were talking, which is you have a kind of common phenomenon, but the consequences are really determined by how society is organized to start with. So I suppose my kind of benchmark way of thinking about something like AI or all this tech would be sort of like that. This can have terrible effects, or it can have, liberating, empowering effects depending on how it's governed. I think the worst thing is that, these things spread without people being really conscious of how they're governed. The consequences only become evident down the road And then there's a concern that it's sort of too late. I like the example of Google, Google Scholar, So now academia, especially the economics profession, is taken over with this obsession with Google Scholar. Like you evaluate people for tenure based on how many citations they have in Google Scholar. Now like people are obsessed with that. And so it turns out, if you think about it, if someone's criticizing your article and saying it's all rubbish, that still counts as one citation, the same as if somebody's citing it and saying it's a piece of genius, But that doesn't matter, it's another citation. It doesn't matter what people are citing you for. And it's like, and without even thinking about it, it's just sort of become incredibly powerful. And and that sort of creeps up on you, right? Without really thinking the thing through. And I guess it's that aspect that you're sort of alluding to, that, suddenly these guys are the richest people in the world and they're launching rockets into space. And, for example, we didn't really understand the property rights were not well defined. People can just take your data and then they can sell it without consulting you. Because why? Because you don't have property rights. Property rights were not well defined. But I would say historically that's very common. It's very common that something becomes valuable, like natural resources or the frontier or whatever, and property rights are vague or they're not well defined. And so it's a free-for-all, and some people make a killing, and it takes time for society to catch up and decide, that's a bit inequitous. We should have figured out that, we all own that. Or maybe the frontier or natural resources are owned collectively by society or the air or whatever.
Great point about property rights around data or the lack thereof. In fact, this point about data being the source of value instead of labor and capital has come up a few times, including in my conversation with Erik Brynjolfsson. Big tech actually makes its products public. The algorithms are often freely available to everyone. The value is in the data, and we, meaning the state and society, gave it to them without understanding the deeper implications of the free product bargain that are now becoming more evident. Seems to me like we need to define some laws around data ownership and rights that benefit individuals and increase state capacity at the same time. I'm seeing some interesting ideas from India around what should be considered quote-unquote public digital infrastructure, which includes things like payments and rights around data. What are your thoughts about this?
No, I mean, I think that makes sense to me. It seems to me that, that these people have been able to make fortunes because property rights are not well defined in some sense. But the history is full of people like that. But you're right that this was not being conceptualized well by economists. It took economists a long time to conceptualize the idea of like human capital, and the idea that human capital and education and, and experience. If you go back to Robert Solow's kind of seminal work on economic growth in the 1950s, which he won the Nobel Prize, it's just physical capital. Like what produces stuff is like machines, and so the idea of like data as being this asset, and I think that hasn't been conceptualized, and people are sort of running around to catch up. Basically there's a lot of interest in economics at the moment about how on earth how do you regulate different systems of property rights, and how do you enforce those, and how do you regulate these companies? I don't know that this could be something so different than what we've seen before that things are going to go off the rails in a way that's very difficult to predict. I guess many people are worried about the kind of big brother aspect of it. The Chinese setting up this incredible system of surveillance and kind of grading their citizens, the social credit system. And what would stop that happening here? Well, I think the answer to that is obvious. It's sort of accountability. It's whistleblowing. It's like making people aware that the government are monitoring you. And again, that could be very powerful, like you're saying. Maybe it can solve all sorts of problems. It can make the government work better. We had a job talk a couple of years ago of this chap, using AI. He's a doctor, a medical doctor, but also an economist. He's using AI to predict heart attacks, and it turns out, you come in with chest pains to the ER or whatever, it turns out a machine is much better at predicting whether you're going to die of a heart attack than a doctor is, because the machine can just process this enormous amount kind of empirical evidence that you just can't keep in your head. And then he was just doing the study, basically looking at people who'd come into the ER and they'd been released, and then they died of a heart attack 2 days later instead of being admitted to hospital. And if you took what was known at the time, you could have predicted much better. And that's a great thing. That seems to be fantastic, that aspect of these things, but that gives you a power that humans can't do. Or, these example of chess, you have these incredible chess machines. And, so I think I find that very exciting. I find it kind of potentially liberating for humans. But yes, the governance of these things has to be thought through, and that's a moving target when there's so much innovation and creativity kind of going on in this space. And I'm not an expert on it either.
No, indeed. It's not often that I see India as getting things right. In fact, for the most part, it seems to find a way of getting in its own way. But this notion of sort of this public digital infrastructure where ownership of data is individual, but yet the state actually facilitates the functioning of the digital economy, without sort of imposing a heavy hand, seems to be an interesting idea. China sort of bothers me because it's just rife for things going wrong. The US at the moment, I see the regulators as being sort of behind the eight ball, but that's understandable because they take a very cautious approach to regulation. But I suspect that they'll come around too and realize that this notion of rights of data and the value associated with data needs to be sort of taken seriously. It's been sort of Wild West days so far, but the hearings I'm seeing on Capitol Hill make me a little more optimistic about getting these things under control.
Good to hear.
Well, James, it's been a pleasure. Fascinating talking to you, as always. I enjoyed reading your book, and I hope to continue this conversation somewhere down the line. We'll know a lot more about how tech has developed in the next 2 or 3 years, and we'll come back and visit the state of our Leviathan in the US and the rest of the world in a couple of years.
Yeah, let's hope so. I look forward to many more conversations, yes.
Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.